morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and thank you for joining today's webinar, the Dynamics GP Year-End Close. I'm Megan Turco, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use your webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle the control tray open or closed, and at the bottom of that control tray, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to use the chat window to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar, and we will get to those as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Additionally, on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option, and alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option instead. Additionally, I do want to note that today's webinar is being recorded, so we will be sending out a link to the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours, so definitely keep an eye out for that message if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today or sharing it with any colleagues who couldn't make it with us live this morning. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First up, we have Leanne McElraith, who is a senior consultant on Armanino's Dynamics GP team. Leanne has over 20 years of GP consulting experience performing implementations for companies spanning a wide range of industries, including life sciences, software, nonprofit, and wholesale retail. She's got extensive experience in the GP core financials, distribution, FRX, and management reporter, as well as fixed assets, multi-currency, and intercompany modules. We also have Zandra Montez with us today. Zandra is a senior consultant on Armanino's GP team. She's got over 10 years of GP consulting experience performing implementations for myriad types of companies, including life sciences, services, food and bev, and retail. She works with clients both domestic and international to gather and document system requirements for the implementation of Dynamics GP, SQL Server reporting services, and custom applications. It's great to have you both with us this morning, and with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Leanne to get us started.
Thank you, Megan. So our agenda for this morning or this afternoon is welcoming you, so welcome to this webinar. We're going to discuss year-end close planning, installing the year-end update, and module closing, each of these individual modules listed here and in the order that they're listed. That's very important. The order that we're going through is what you'd want to follow. So in regards to planning, I would recommend that you create a checklist similar to what you see here, listing each of the steps, when they're due, who will do them, and the duration. This way you keep track of all the steps that are involved, and everybody knows what their role is in the closing process. In regards to installing the year-end update, this is provided by Microsoft, and they usually release it mid to late November. And right now the estimated date is November 20th, so you want to be on the lookout for that. There will be a separate download depending on the version of GP that you're on. So you will have a link to those when those updates are available for download. And do note that this year-end update must be installed not only on the GP server, but also on each computer that has GP installed on it. And of course, if you need any assistance in that, you can contact our help desk. So what is in the year-end update this year? Luckily, there are no W-2 or W-3 form changes. There are some W-2 electronic filing changes. There are product quality fixes around payroll year-end. There are Affordable Care Act updates. And there's a change in the fixed asset luxury auto depreciation. But do be aware there could be additional changes added to this before it actually gets released. So listed here are the links to the detailed steps for closing of each of the modules. So we're going to go over those today, but for your future reference, we have links for you to get to the documents that have even more detail. And there's also a link at the bottom for the blog series on year-end closing for a variety of information. So now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zandra to start with the closing of receivables.
Good morning or good afternoon to you. As Leanne mentioned, there's a suggested order for closing modules based off of typical closing activities. Of the modules that we're going to review, Receivables, payables, and inventory are treated as optional because they are date sensitive and they are primarily capturing year-to-date information. If transactions are posted for the following year for any of those modules mentioned, you can consider skipping the year-end close process for them as the year-to-date information will be somewhat skewed. However, for fixed assets and the GL close processes, those are required. A couple of suggestions before you begin any year-end close process is to create a year-end close folder on your network and consider switching your default printer from GP to PDF. That way any reports that are generated as a result of closing activities can be saved to that folder. Before beginning any year-end procedures, you'd also want to make sure that you have a recent company database backup in case anything unexpected happens during your close. It's strictly a precaution, but it can definitely save you some heartache if there are any unexpected issues that come up. You'd also want to follow your standard month-end process for closing receivables, such as generating commissions, reconciling the aging to the GL, and it's always best practice to close the fiscal periods to prevent users from accidentally posting transactions. If you discover you have any balance inconsistencies, you may also consider running the reconcile process. And typically the reconcile routine will correct these. However, you do want to ensure that you have a database backup in case the reconcile yields any unexpected results. So what does closing the AR module actually do? Well, technically the receivables close is broken into two types of close procedures, calendar year and fiscal year. If your fiscal year is the calendar year, then you can actually perform the closes simultaneously. The year-end close moves the finance charge data into the last year calendar field. And the fiscal year end close basically moves all other amounts besides the finance charges into the last year column in summary windows. So one reminder here that actually applies to payables, receivables, and inventory is that the close procedures are driven based off of the date of the actual close, not by document date. So for maximum accuracy, you'd want to run the close right after all transactions have been posted for the year you intend to close, but before any transactions are entered for the new year. If that's not the case, it's not necessarily detrimental to anything. You just want to be aware that your summary windows may not be 100% accurate. This is the path in the window where the receivables close is completed. As you can see, you can process the calendar and fiscal closes at the same time or separately. You can also see the last close dates. So this could be a quick way to confirm whether the close has been processed previously or not. This will capture the year-end data, the year-end date, but not the exact date that the close was performed. And one suggestion before running the closes or a reminder rather, would be to change your default printer to PDF because the receivables close can yield quite a sizable report and you don't necessarily want to print that on physical paper. And you can have the ability to save that to your year-end close folder. The next module to close would be the payables or the purchasing module. Similar to the receivables, closing the payables module will capture summary statistics. Before starting any year-end process, again, you'll want to make sure that you have a fresh database backup. If you don't know what that is, you can reach out to your IT team or even the Armanino Help Desk and they can assist with that. With the payables close, you'll want to follow again your standard month-end process for closing the payables, such as ensuring all your transactions are posted, reconciling the aging to the GL, and closing your fiscal periods. And there's also a reconcile routine for payables if you find balance inconsistencies in your reports. If you process 1099s, you'll also want to make sure that those details are captured accurately. A reminder here that payables, similar to receivables, is not dependent on transaction date, so you would want to follow the rule of posting everything that is applicable for the year that you're closing and not post any activity for the new year if at all possible. You'll also want to make sure that any vendors that should be set up as 1099 are set up correctly. And if you need to make any modifications for your 1099 details, you will be able to do so before processing those. In the case that 1099 information has not been captured accurately, or possibly this is your first year in GP and prior 1099 amounts aren't fully captured for the year, you may need to manually edit those amounts, and this is the screen where you would be able to do that, edit 1099 details. Since the deadline for filing 1099s in most cases will be January 31st, we do suggest that you start reviewing your vendors and your 1099 details sooner rather than later in case any modifications are needed. That also applies whether you may potentially need assistance from Armanino. We'd also recommend that you start planning that and schedule it as soon as possible, as particularly during year-end, calendars tend to book up fast because we do have several clients looking for assistance. For 1099s, if you have the need to run more than 250 records and you must file electronically, go ahead and reach out to Armanino and we can put you in contact with appropriate resources. Prior to running the year-end routine, it's also a good idea to validate that all vendor records are set to maintain history, so that's just a reminder. This screen here for the 1099 setup. Normally, the 1099 amounts in GP are in sync with standard reporting requirements. However, it's a good idea to come to this window and validate that the default thresholds are correct for all applicable 1099 boxes. In the company setup window, you want to make sure that your company's tax ID is populated. That way the information will default in at the time that you are processing reports. Otherwise, you'll need to manually type it in when you process your 1099s. In the Print 1099 window, you'll be able to print a 1099 edit list and review all the data for the proposed forms to be printed. Again, if you populated your company's tax ID in the company setup window, you should see it populated in this window. You'll also have the ability from this window to print an alignment form and 1096 forms if applicable. And once you've validated all your data and have confirmed the alignment, you can proceed with printing your 1099s. Similar to the receivables close window, you can also see the last close date when you are closing the payables module, and you can print the report to PDF and save in your year-end folder. The next suggested module to close would be the inventory module. And similar to the receivables and payables, this will capture summary statistics. Apologies for sounding like a broken record, but really before any close procedures, we do recommend that you create a fresh database backup. You'll want to follow standard month-end process for closing the inventory module, such as ensuring that all sales, purchasing, and inventory transactions are posted. You'd want to reconcile your either historical stock status or your HITB report to the GL and close the fiscal period for the inventory module. If you have quantity inconsistencies, you may also consider running the inventory reconcile process. It is noteworthy here if you maintain inventory and this is applicable to you. Typically, the reconcile routine will correct quantities, but you do want to validate the runtime for this, because if you do not customarily run the inventory reconcile routine, it can take several hours. So you might want to do it overnight or on a weekend. Depending on the number of transactions, this process can take quite a bit of time. So it's not something that you want to interrupt your day-to-day activities if you can at all avoid it. So what exactly does the inventory close actually do in GP? Similar to payables and receivables, it's transferring summarized information into inquiry windows. So it updates beginning quantity amounts for each item site combination. It zeroes out the quantity sold. And you also, on top of that, get the option to remove certain pieces of data from GP. This is the path in the window for closing the inventory module. And you also see the options of the data that you are able to remove, such as discontinued items, sold lot attributes, sold receipts, and you also can update an item's standard cost if your company uses standard costing. And it's also worth noting here that unlike most of the module closes, the inventory module doesn't actually yield a report. So you'll just process it, it'll be done, but no report will generate. In order to remove discontinued items, it's noteworthy here is obviously the item must be marked as discontinued, but it also must have a 0 on-hand quantity in order for the option to remove discontinued items to actually work. In order to remove sold receipts, the remaining value for those layers of inventory must be 0. And again, if you are using item standard costing, any of the periodic valuation methods, you do have the option to override the current cost, the standard cost with the current cost for each item. And the final module that I'll be reviewing is the fixed asset module. You'd want to proceed with your standard month-end closing procedures, including running any depreciation for the year that's going to be closed or creating any fixed asset additions, as well as printing any applicable reports, which you can save to PDF in your folder. And there's some examples of reports that we would recommend printing and having a copy of in your year-end close folder. So the closing of the fixed asset module will clear out year-to-date amounts and update some of the beginning balances for the new year. So you do want to be mindful of that and do this in a timely manner so your year-to-date information for your fixed assets will be accurate. And this is the path and window for closing the fixed asset module. And as a reminder here, if you are maintaining multiple fixed asset books, you will want to run the close process for all of your books in this window. And once the close process is complete, you can validate the current year in the book setup under the current fiscal year field within that window just to validate that the close has actually completed. And with that, I will hand it back over to Leanne.
Thank you, Zandra. So on to the general ledger. So listed here are the steps that you will follow to close the general ledger. Very similar to all the other modules, the very first one is that you want to complete all of the month-end processes. So making sure that all the transactions for the period 12 or earlier for that matter have all been posted and reports been generated. And we do want to note that you don't necessarily have to wait to close the general ledger year and later on when you get a final adjusting entries maybe from your auditor or your CPA. In Great Plains, the general ledger is the closing process. It allows you to actually post to a closed year, and what it does is it will recognize that the year is closed later when you go to post to a closed year. There's two things that have to be in place that I'll be pointing out a little bit later, but you need to have the, so let me back up for a moment. So you, when you know you've completed most of the transactions that you know for the year 2017, and let's say that's the first or second week of January. So you can close the year, and that will roll forward the balances for the next year for 2018. And then months later, when you get your final adjusting entries, all you need to do is have a setting on your GL setup that I'm going to be showing you in a moment that you will mark to allow posting to history. And then you also have to have period 12 in the fiscal periods window open, and that will allow you to enter transactions dated 12/31/17, and it's going to roll forward those amounts to the beginning balances accordingly to 2018 as if those transactions had been there when the year was closed. So that's a common misconception. People think that they have to leave the year open until they get those final adjustments. Another thing that you're going to do is print your financial statements. Now, again, you don't have to do those just this moment when you're closing. You can certainly do those after, but at some point you're going to want to do your financial statements. And yes, you're going to need to create a new fiscal year that may come into a requirement earlier than the end of the year. Typically you'll find that you need this when you're starting to set up your budget for the new year. So when you're ready, you need to set up the budget for the new year, or if you have accrual entries that are going to reverse the 1st of January of 2018, at that point you're going to need to have that new year set up. Another thing that you're going to do is check that your retained earnings account is correct. On the GL setup window, I'll be showing you that. There is a financial reconcile utility you can run to make sure that your data is nice and clean for the year-end close. Then you'll want to check the available space to make sure that the process will be able to conduct itself properly and having enough space on the computer. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Verifying account posting types, and then making a backup to the prior to your year-end close. We always, as Sandra was saying, we need to make a backup, or we recommend that you make a backup before as well as after, so that you have a complete official record of what your database was before and after the year-end close. So just what does the general ledger year-end close mean? What does that do? So the year-end close process, it closes the balance of all profit and loss accounts to the retained earnings account. So that's why it's important that you check what that retained earnings account is so that you're sure that they close properly. And then in regards to the balance sheet accounts, the ending balance of the balance sheet accounts are rolled forward to the beginning balance of the following year. Also, all the transactions for that year being closed, they're going to be moved out of the open transaction file and into the historical transaction file. And so this is why that step of making sure that the system has, your server has enough room for twice the amount of the GL open file is the fact that it's going to be moving the transactions temporarily from the 20,000 table before it actually moves them into the GL 30,000 table. So if you're not sure how to make if you're not aware of how to make sure that you have enough data on your server, that's really more of an IT question, so you'd want to talk with your IT staff in regards to that. And you can remove inactive GL accounts as long as they don't have a balance and no historical transactions. And the year that gets closed, that will be marked as historical, and that's partially how the system determines when you're posting to a closed year and that it needs to roll forward the activity to the beginning balance of the next year. So that's very important that the year gets marked, and that's done automatically. Also, if you're using the Analytical Accounting module, that module gets closed automatically along with the General Ledger year-end close. So in regards to some setup options that you'll want to be sure to double check, so this is the General Ledger setup window shown here. And a couple of things, or a few things I'd like to point out is in the middle there is the retained earnings account that you want to be sure is the appropriate one to close all of the profit and loss account balances into that account. So that's one thing to check. Also, where it says maintain history, you want to make sure that all three of these boxes are marked. There's really no reason that these should ever be unmarked, but you want to be absolutely sure that they are marked, especially the, well, what would happen if they weren't is when you close the year, all of your transactions for that year would be gone because they wouldn't move to history. So that's why this maintain history marking these boxes is so very important. And then in the middle here, here's the box posting, allow posting to history. So that was one of the things I mentioned that would need to be in place if you close the year and then later on have final adjusting entries from your auditor or CPA. Also up above you have an, oops, let me go back to that for just a moment. At the top, there, the next journal entry number, you could change that if you wanted to, but you could just let it continue on. If you wanted to flip it back to start with number 1, you could do that, but it's not necessary. You could just have it continue on with the next number there. Okay, so one of the steps, and this is a very important step, but actually a very easy step to do, is confirming the posting types of your general ledger accounts. And what that means is that you want to make sure that all of your balance sheet accounts are truly set up with the posting type of balance sheet, and that all your profit and loss accounts are set up truly with the posting type of profit and loss. And the easiest or simplest way to do this is to run a smart list here under the financial accounts folder. And the simplest thing you can do is set up one for each, searching for balance sheets that need to be fixed or profit and loss accounts that need to be fixed by setting the criteria for the account range. In this example, the account range would be P&L accounts, but we're looking for posting types of balance sheet accounts. That would be a problem. That's something that's incorrect, and that would show up on your smart list. So it's very clear as to an account that needs to be fixed. So a very easy step to follow, but a very important one, because you don't want to be closing the, do your close and then run your trial balance for 2018 and find you have a beginning balance for a P&L account. It's no fun. There's a number of steps you have to go through to fix that. So following this step will prevent that headache from happening. And then if you have unit accounts, these are the accounts that are tracking quantities rather than dollars. Each unit account on the unit account maintenance window, there's a checkbox here that says clear balance during year-end close. So this depends on how you're using your unit accounts. So if you're using your unit accounts, or a particular unit account, as a balance sheet account where you would want the ending balance to be brought forward as the beginning balance of the next year, then you would not want to have this marked. But if you're using the unit account more like a profit and loss account, then you do want it marked, meaning that you want to clear that balance when the close, so it's starting over fresh in the new year. And this setting is on each individual account. So you want to view each of your accounts, your unit accounts, to make sure that those are set up properly. As I mentioned before, with analytical accounting, that does automatically get closed during the general ledger close. We do recommend that you take a look at this document that we have the link for here, running through steps to check the health of your analytical accounting records. And that just makes sure that when the close occurs that the information is properly closed for your analytical accounting fields. And it would even be we recommend a good idea, it would be a good idea to run through the close of the year end in a test database, in a company test database, so you can see what the results are and make sure that there's no surprises, that the fields are as you expect afterwards. And on that note, it could be even a good idea to run your entire close in a test company first, should you want to see what the result is going to be, especially if it's the first time you've gone through a year-end close. That would give you an idea how much time it's going to take in each of the modules, and so you'll be that much more prepared and comfortable about the closing process if you run it through it first in a test company database. So with the general ledger year-end closing, the window, much like the other closing windows, fairly simple. Not a whole lot going on the window, but some very crucial pieces of information. And first off is the retained earnings account, and that's the account that we saw on the general ledger setup window. This is your one last chance to double check and make sure that is in fact the account that you want your profit and loss account balances to close into. And then we have the starting journal entry number. This is actually the journal entry that's going to be assigned to the closing entry. There is a journal entry that gets created from the closing process. Notice that the year is grayed out. You don't get to choose the year. It should automatically come up as 2017. It's going to show the oldest open year. So it should automatically come up as 2017. And then over here you have some options. Most particularly, I want to point out is the maintaining inactive accounts. So if you mark this box to maintain inactive accounts, you can also say, well, what condition of those accounts do you want to save? Do you want to save accounts with inactive accounts only if they have budget amounts, or do you want to maintain all of your inactive accounts? So what's key here is you may have some accounts that you've made inactive because you don't actually post transactions to them, but you have budget amounts stored in there for budget to actual comparisons. So if that's the case and you mark this box, you want to make sure that at the very least you choose to maintain those that have budget amounts. But if you're concerned, you can, and you don't want to get rid of any of them, then you could mark this box and mark it to include all or save all the inactive accounts. When you're ready to go, you've got the close year button that you would click. Be very careful that you click this button only once, because if you click it twice, you'll end up closing 2017 and then 2018 right after it. Now, there is a button here to reverse closing a historical year. That is available if you, in situations like that, if you accidentally close a year and you weren't ready to do so. But to keep things as smooth as possible, just be careful and mark this button, close year, once. The process will run, and if it does seem to stop at, say, or it seems like the progress window that you see, if it stops at or seems to hold off at 50% at some point, do not worry. Just let it keep running. It will complete, and you'll get the posting journal when it is done. So that's basically the going through the year-end process for the general ledger. So last but not least, I'm going to go over the closing for the payroll module. And that module has its own set of procedures, just like the other modules. And there are a number of them, and the order that we have them listed here is the order that you would want to follow. It's starting with verifying that you have the latest 2017 payroll tax update, and that is important, and I'll get into that in a moment when I go on to the other slides. But that's one of the first things you're going to want to do. Also, in pointing out step number 4, complete month-end and quarter-end payroll procedures. So again, just like with your other modules, you're going to go through your normal month-end and quarter-end processes, just like you would do for any other month. And that includes closing the period on the fiscal period setup window. So that's a procedure, a step that you can take along the way, just to be sure that you're by no way can someone either intentionally or accidentally post to payroll for 2017 once you think you're finally done. So I am going to go through each of the steps here. So talking about the first step, checking for the latest tax update. So shown here is the window where you would check for that. That's the payroll tax setup window. The path to that window is listed up above. And you're looking for the last tax update field here. Now, depending on where you have employees, what states your employees reside in, that will determine what you want that date to be, or not to be prior to a particular date. So this side window here, or table I should say, this is showing the last tax update date depending on what states are involved. So at the very least, you should have a date in that field of 12/16/2016, because they do release the tax updates just prior to the appropriate year. So this one here for 12/16/2016, that was for 2017. And then there were some other releases for other states. So if you have employees in Maine, then your last tax update should have the date of 8/11/2017. If you find that this last tax update is prior to the appropriate date for you, then you're going to need to go to Customer Source and download the appropriate tax update. And if you're uneasy or unsure how to go about doing that, you can contact our help desk for assistance. The next step is installing the year-end update. And I do want to point out that there's a big difference between a tax update and the year-end update. So a tax update, if I go back for a moment here, this tax update only has to be loaded once, not on every single workstation. So that covers, it's done once and it's set. The year-end update, that has program changes, and that's why it would need to be installed on each workstation that has Great Plains installed on it. So this is the year-end update I was discussing at the beginning or earlier in the webinar, and that's going to be available mid to late November. And depending on what version of GP you're on, you can go to these links that we have here for you and go to the location and be able to download that, get it installed on the server, and then each workstation. And again, if you need assistance on that, you can certainly call our help desk, our GP help desk. So timing is very, very key with payroll, probably just as much, as not more, if not more, than the other modules. So you would want to load this before you do the year-end wage file, which is going to be basically one of the next steps. So timing is very, very key. So let me back up for a moment again, talking about the tax update. So this is the first step that you want to do, and partially why this is important is that this makes sure that you have the proper FICA maximum amounts, or FICA limits, I should say. The year-end update, you may recall, is this year it's involving mostly payroll. There weren't any 1099 changes for AP, so you don't have to worry about that. There was a change for fixed asset luxury auto depreciation. So those are the things that would be involved with this year-end update. And then the next step is creating that year-end wage file. So this is basically the heart of the actual process of the close, is creating this file. So because of that, we recommend that you make a company database, a backup of your company database, and then come to this window, and basically what you want to do here is make absolutely sure you've got the right year, and then you click the process button. Okay, once that's completed, it will tell you when it's completed. Then you want to make another backup of your company database. So you say, this is what it was like after we created the year-end wage file. And the reason that year-end wage file is so important is that is what the W-2 information is pulled from. So the next step you want to do is view that W-2 information, and you can do that on this window here, the year-end wage report. The key here is to select the appropriate year, so this year would be 2017. And you can run it for all employees or a specific employee. You can run this numerous times, but this is where you can see the information that's going to be on the W-2s. Now, if you find that there's something that needs to be adjusted, that something isn't quite right on a W-2, you can come to the Edit W-2 information window. And listed here, as you can see, the fields in white can be changed. So you can make an adjustment here. This main window here is for federal taxes. If you need to make a change that's in regards to state or local or special taxes, you have buttons at the bottom of this window to go to those edit windows to edit that information. But please keep in mind that changes that you make here do not affect the live payroll data. So for example, if you made a change to a employee's address, you would need to also do that, go back to the employee card and make the same change, because this is just changing information that's going to be on the W-2. And then once you've made those adjustments and you are ready to print your W-2 forms, you would come to this window, and the path is shown up above at the top. And there are a number of preliminary reports you can run to be absolutely sure that everything is good to go with your W-2s. Especially there's this validation report here, and that can be handy to make sure that there's no missing addresses, there's no addresses that are being chopped off because they're too long, that all the Social Security numbers are valid and they're being shown. So that can be very handy. When you're actually printing the W-2 forms, you've got the other selections down here for actually printing those. And very important that your employer identification number be filled in down here as well. So once you have completed your processes for 2017, you've created the year and wage file, you've adjusted your W-2s, any adjustments that were needed, you've generated the W-2s, there's no more payroll payments for 2017, then you're ready to load the tax file for 2018. So again, timing is very, very key in regards to this step. So we actually recommended, notice down here at the bottom of the screen here, that you wait till shortly before your first payroll run in 2018 to load this tax update, because the very late last minute adjustment for 2017, you don't want to have these 2018 tax tables in there because that would be invalid. So that's why we recommend that you wait as long as you possibly can to load these. Okay. When you are ready, you basically follow the path as shown at the top here, and then it gives you a choice as to what method. We recommend choosing the automatic method. You come over here to the login credentials, and you would enter your authorization number. If you don't know what your authorization number is, you can go to Customer Source and locate that number. It's typically your phone number for when the system was first purchased. And then lastly, if you have over 250 employees, you need to do W-2 electronic filing, and the path is listed up above here. And the main thing here is make sure that you have the right year, you select the appropriate companies, and you need to have your user ID number here. That's the PIN number that was provided to you, and then you can click the Submitter button. And that basically wraps up the payroll year-end closing, so I'm going to pass it over to Megan.
Thanks, Leanne. And now we do have a few questions that came in from the audience. I do want to remind you guys, I know I've gotten a few questions on whether or not you'll be able to access the webinar after today. We did record today's webinar, so you'll be able to access the on-demand recording as well as a PDF of the slides. So all of those links that Leanne and Zandra showed you guys today, you'll be able to access those as soon as you get the slides within about 2 days or so. So you'll be able to share them with other folks on your teams who weren't able to join us live, or if you want to go back and reference some of the links or the content that Leanne and Zandra mentioned, you will be getting those shortly. And with that, we do have some questions that came in from the audience. You guys are welcome to submit more questions if you have additional ones that come in, and then I will also share Leanne and Zandra's contact information as well as the Armanino Help Desk information. So if you guys have questions after today's webinar as well, you'll be able to reach out with anything else that comes up regarding the GP year-end close, so you can have those questions answered. So first, and Zandra, I think that this is actually one of yours. So one of the questions asked, what happens if we've never run the year-end close for our AP or AR modules?
So that's a good question. Nothing detrimental to the system will happen. Really, with those modules and even inventory included, it's really capturing or summarizing information up until that point. So if you haven't historically done it, it's okay to continue that way. You just want to be aware that some of your summary inquiry windows will not necessarily reflect true year-to-date information.
Awesome. Thanks, Sandra. And actually, I believe that this one has to do with our inventory module. Again, Sandra, sorry, this one's towards you. Leanne, I've got a couple for you as well.
No worries.
If you click on the discontinued items in the inventory module to be removed, is there a way to bring them back if you need them for some reason later?
Unfortunately, there is not. So you do want to be mindful of that. It does sound like a good practice in theory, maybe to clean up some historical information, but you do want to be aware once you remove those items, you're removing the master records of those items and also any transactional history. So if it's something that you may potentially need to reference again in the future, you would lose that if you remove them during the year-end close process.
And Leanne, this one actually is for you. How can you post to a closed fiscal year, or can you?
Excellent question. So you may recall there is a field on the General Ledger setup window that you need to have marked. It says allow posting to history. That's one thing you would need in place. And the other thing is to open up period 12 in the financial series on the fiscal period setup window. With those two things in place, you'll be able to post to a closed year, and it will roll forward the amounts accordingly to the beginning balances in the next year. And once you're done with that, then you would want to close up period 12 again on the fiscal period setup window.
Thanks, Leanne. I actually have one more for each of you. So Zandra, I guess I'll have you first up here. Is there a way to run an accurate balance sheet if we haven't completed the year-end close?
Yes, actually. So it wouldn't necessarily be within GP. If you were to try and look at beginning balances for accounts and you haven't closed the year, those won't be accurate within GP. However, in Management Reporter, you can do some modifications to capture last year's activity and any activity for the current year to actually kind of auto-calculate what the true balances are for this year. So if for any reason you aren't able to close a year and you want to be able to print accurate balance sheets, you can do that in Management Reporter. If you need assistance, you can definitely reach out to us and we can help with that.
Thanks, Sandra. And actually, we have gotten a few more questions, so it's actually more than one for each of you. Sorry about that. A quick one, and I believe that you guys might have touched on this a bit, but installing the year-end update is required. That's correct?
It is required if the changes that are made would impact you. So we always recommended that you load it because then your system is at the current basically the current version of GP. But this year, there are no changes that affect accounts payable. So let's say that you don't use the payroll module and you don't use the fixed asset module, you really don't need to load it. It wouldn't hurt anything. But certainly, absolutely, if you're using the payroll module, you must load the year-end update on the server and every workstation. And if you, as one other combination, let's say you are using the fixed asset module, not payroll, but you're using the fixed asset module and payables, still, if you don't use that luxury auto feature, then it wouldn't have any impact on you. But if you're not sure if you're using the luxury auto feature, then I would recommend that you go ahead and get that update loaded.
Thanks, Leanne.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, also, I think, Leanne, this one's for one of your sections as well. What financial utility is the optional task in the GL closing process?
Right, so that is known as check links, and that is under the area in Great Plains under Microsoft Dynamics GP maintenance, and then you choose check links. And what you want to do is with that, it defaults to the series of financial, and it will have a bunch of tables listed on the left. So those are all the financial tables, and it's recommended that you run the check links on all of those tables with a couple exceptions. So we can, of course, help you with that if you haven't gone through that before, but that ensures that there's no orphaned records. Maybe during the year there was some kind of a posting interruption, and you might have called us and we helped you and you got everything cleaned up and everything seems to be working fine. There still may be an orphaned record out there that might cause the system to be confused when it's going through the year-end process. It may not, but it's always a good practice to run that process, the check links, to make sure it's absolutely clean, and it's just kind of like good housekeeping that you do once a year. So that's the process that we're referring to.
Awesome. Thanks, Leanne. So we did get a few questions that are specific to your company's specific environment or being hosted through one thing or another. So if those questions are one of yours, we will get back to you guys separately offline so that it's specific to your actual answer rather than a general answer. And then one last question that we got is if we'll be able to send out a reminder when the update is available, and we can certainly do that for you guys as well so that you can see when it actually comes out from Microsoft. And we can certainly include the PDF of these slides from today's webinar in it again as a reminder for that when the update is available for you guys later this month. I believe, like Leanne had mentioned early on in the webinar, it's approximately slated for November 20th, but we will definitely be able to send you guys a reminder when the actual update is available. Up on the screen here, you will see Leanne, Zondra's, and our help desk's contact information. Like I mentioned, I'll be sending a link to the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours or so. So you'll be able to write down this information if you don't have it already. Of course, if you're already in touch with someone on our GP support team or one of our other GP consultants, you're also always welcome to reach out to them as well. If you have any questions about the GP year-end close or anything that we talked about today. So definitely keep an eye out for that email with the link to the slides and the recording. You can share it with your team or just reference the webinar itself. And with that, I'm actually going to thank Leanne and Zondra for participating in our webinar today. You guys did some great job with all that content. And for our attendees, thank you guys so much for joining us for your morning or your early afternoon. And as you exit, there is a quick survey, so definitely take a moment to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar, and anything that you have any additional questions on, we would be happy to answer. And with that, thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.